You're listening to How to Blow Up Your Life, a podcast about the courage, clarity, and chaos of beginning again. I'm Sara Stansberry, writer, coach, and guide for women reclaiming their truth. Let's begin. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Season 2 of the How to Blow Up Your Life podcast. I am Sara Stansberry, and I am your host for this second season. And we are starting things off talking about the three different kind of parts of you. I like to sometimes refer to them as chairs. So we're going to be talking about the three different aspects of the adult chair model, which is the model, the coaching modality that I'm trained in, if you don't know. So we're going to be doing a 3-part series on this. And the first part of this series, we'll be talking about the child chair, which is your inner child. And then we'll be going into the adolescent chair, which is the ego. And then going further into the adult chair, which is your fully actualized self, your healthiest self, your best self, so to speak. So as we dive in here today, we're going to be talking about the inner child, like I said. And I want to start off this segment by sharing with you a little bit about a personal moment that I just experienced that might give you kind of a good idea of what I'm talking about. So I have been, reviewing my work for my book. And what I had this kind of moment where somebody said something to me in terms of, I was getting feedback basically for the book. And I started kind of getting defensive with the person, even though they were really just giving me their feedback that I asked for. Now, just mind you, I did ask for the feedback. And I started getting defensive and I start to kind of get a little angry, and my emotions don't quite match the situation. They're a little bit more intense than the situation warrants. And I had to kind of stop and ask myself, like, what is really going on here? And what ended up happening is I had the awareness that what was happening is I was operating. There was a part of me that was kind of in my inner child. Like I was allowing this part of my inner child to kind of take over the situation or take over the conversation. And it was a wounded part of me. And it was a part that I realized wasn't quite fully healed yet, a part that, I feel like had been probably sitting there for many years. And I had to kind of come to terms with that and reconcile with that. So that's called a trigger. If you don't know, when something in your current environment activates something from your past, that's called a trigger. And so what I want you to think about today as we're having this discussion is, what if the emotions that you've been taught to suppress are actually the keys to your emotional freedom? So be thinking about that, because in this episode, we are going to learn more about your inner child. And you're going to learn that it's not about becoming childish. It's really about reclaiming your authentic feelings and your authentic needs, and ultimately your authentic self. So, what even is the child chair? What is an inner child? What happens is there are 3 stages of development, essentially. So your inner child gets developed at ages 0 through 7 in your true kind of childhood. And it becomes the seat of our true feelings, how we feel about things, what we need. It becomes the seat of our creativity. It becomes the seat of our vulnerability and our ability to connect with ourselves and others and the world around us. There are so many great aspects to the inner child part of yourself. Your spontaneity and joy sit there. Your deep capacity for intimacy is there. It gives us a tool to connect with others, like I said. Creative expression is there, and also your intuition and your knowing of, like, what your needs are and what you really need as a human and as an individual. So that intuitive part of you sits there as well. And like I said, it's kind of developed at ages 0 through 7. What happens during our childhood, and this happens for everybody, it doesn't really matter what kind of family you came from or what your situation was. You could have the healthiest of parents and still have woundedness in your inner child. So what ends up happening is that as you grow and as you're in this formative state, you essentially begin making sense of your world, making sense of like how you fit into your world. And your needs aren't met, your emotional needs aren't met, sometimes physical or whatever, and you begin telling yourself or shutting down parts of yourself so that your world begins to make sense a little bit more or starts making sense. And we can disconnect from our inner child because of trauma that we experience, big T or little t trauma, could become at the hands of our family systems. It could just be a result of cultural conditioning. But basically, anywhere where we were taught that our feelings weren't important, that we weren't important, that we weren't safe or welcome. So what happens is when we abandon our inner children, our inner child, we start to lose access to that true and authentic parts of ourselves. And when we do that, of course, we get cut off from ourselves. We don't really know how we're even feeling about anything. Maybe we don't feel anything at all. Maybe we're like doing what I described in the beginning of this episode, where we are having these like really highly emotional reaction to something that really doesn't warrant that kind of highly emotional reaction. So if that happens, then you probably know you might be coming at the situation through your unhealed inner child. So how do we know if we might be doing that? The biggest way that we can identify if we're sitting in our child chair or in our unhealed inner child is we can sometimes feel that in our body. So if your chest is getting really tight, if there are tears, or even if you're just excited, like you can't really calm your nervous system down because you're so excited. Or you could even be open. It doesn't have to be, a negative thing. You could see that you're in your child self if you're extremely open and loving and open to emotion and things like that. The emotional signatures of the inner child is like, think of it when you were a little kid, right? How you played with abandon and you could just do what, like you were just in the moment. You were accessing just that pure joy without reason is your inner child. Or on the opposite end, you can experience a deep, deep sadness or hurt or really raw hurt. Sometimes it comes out when we're adults, when boundaries are crossed, or when there's like some sort of fear of abandonment or rejection. These are all triggers that kind of put you in your unhealed inner child. Also, feelings of being unheard or dismissed, rejection, criticism, kind of all that kind of stuff. Another big one for me, especially, is when you feel like you're being controlled or having your choices taken away. I know, for instance, when I feel like I'm backed into a corner or there's no solution, then I realize I'm operating from a younger, unhealed part of myself. I get really tight in the chest. I can't breathe. And I begin to kind of feel like there are no solutions, no choices. I have no power. And we know when we're operating in our fully actualized self, that's not really the truth, because when your adult self is in charge, then those things don't quite happen. I want to talk a little bit about how you honor your inner child versus being hijacked by your inner child, which sometimes, so let me go back to the unhealed parts of your inner child will come up over and over again in all different circumstances in your life until they are healed. So if you have there's a part of your childhood where you weren't fully seen, you weren't fully heard, you felt overpowered. That created a part in you that kind of broke off. You probably suppressed it down, and it becomes like a sticking point that will appear over and over and over again until you bring it to the light and you heal it. So sometimes what happens is, my therapist calls it, your little girl is running the show. You can call it that, or it being hijacked, like when something's being hijacked. There's a difference. Like there's a difference from operating like from your healthy, integrated inner child versus when you're being hijacked from a wounded part of you. So if you're being hijacked, an example would be like if you have an outburst when you don't get your way, or you just shut down completely when you don't get your way, or you shut down completely when you're hurt. If you start people pleasing in hopes to avoid abandonment, that could be a signal that your wounded inner child is kind of running the show. If you're in a place of honoring, a place of healthy inner child, of this like wonderful, joyful, full presence, this beautiful joy. If you're honoring that inner child, you might say to yourself, like if an event happens, like, I notice I'm feeling really hurt right now. And that makes sense because maybe the situation is hurtful. If you're in your fully actualized self and that part of you is not wounded anymore, this child part of you, you'll be able to say, like, I notice I'm feeling really hurt right now. And that makes sense without all of the emotion behind it. So, how do we deal with this if we are in our wounded inner child? Well, one thing that we can do, right, is set boundaries from a place of self-care. And we can ask for what we need clearly and directly. The fully actualized adult in you, it has a job to take care of that wounded inner child or that inner child. So the adult chair's job is to create safety for your child chair so that it can exist fully and be in that true joy and compassion. So I want to talk a little bit about practical tools. So like, how do we get there, right? How do we get to the place where we can be in this pure abandonment of love and joy and presence and all of the wonderful things that your child self brings to the table? Here are some tools. So one thing that you can do is, first of all, be aware that this might be happening, because I think that kind of is the biggest problem that I see with the clients that I work with, is there's not really an awareness of these wounded parts of ourselves that are kind of running around and sometimes running the show. And I think if we all worked in this world, worked a little bit more intentionally about trying to heal those parts of ourselves, I think the world would be a much better place. So how do we do this? I think that checking in with the child parts of yourself, or part of yourself, whatever's being brought to the surface, ask that part, like, what is it? What do you need today? Do you need rest? Do you need play? Do you need comfort? Do you need connection? Maybe you need to express yourself creatively. I think that is a really, really great place to start in healing your inner child. I like to do this through journaling. You can do it through some visualization, and just kind of asking that part of you, what do you need to be seen and heard and validated? So one thing that you can do, and we'll do an exercise together here, you can put your hand on your heart, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and ask yourself, what are you feeling right now? What are you feeling right now? Now, I want you to listen without judgment and then validate that part of you. Of course, you're feeling that way. Makes total sense. I hear you. I can see that you're really hurt. And as you're moving through this work and you are making the commitment to seek out your inner child, there will be moments where you might have an opportunity to actually reparent yourself. And so, in those moments where you're checking in with your inner child and you're asking, how do you really feel? What do you need? Speak to yourself like you needed to be spoken to as a child. Really see that inner part of yourself that may not have been seen. You can create a sense of safety when your inner child is activated. And so you can use that as a healing modality. Another thing that you can do is express yourself creatively, like drawing or dancing or singing, anything that you loved to do as a kid, like playing a game, or some people like to do physical like games like tag or something like that, where, just kind of running with pure joy and delight, just having a great time. I think of I don't know if you've ever watched Friends, but kind of like Phoebe running in Central Park. Do you remember that episode where she was like, her arms were like flailing all around and she was like, that's how she ran. I just absolutely love that. She was letting her inner child, I bet she was like really connecting with her inner child there. So letting your inner child really play is so important. I think we release play as we grow up. We think we don't have time to do that. We think it's silly or whatever. And it isn't silly. Anytime you can connect that way with your inner child, it's just going to validate that part of you. That part of you is going to become a little bit more seen, a little bit more known. And it is only going to increase your joy and satisfaction. So play all you want. So key takeaways a little bit from this episode. So don't forget, your child chair, your inner child, it holds your emotional truth. It's not something to fix or something to control, but it is something to honor and protect. So as you're kind of listening to this and moving through this, think of the ways that you can connect with your inner child. Think of the ways that you can honor them, support them, heal them if they need it, and love them so that they can fully integrate themselves into you. Now, in the next part of the series, we're diving into the adolescent chair, which is the ego part of us. It's that protective, perfectionistic part that's been trying to keep your child self safe, but it might be exhausting you in the process. So stay tuned for that one. This week, I encourage you to practice asking your child self what it needs and see what happens when you actually listen. Thanks for being here today. If this episode spoke to you, hit follow so you never miss an episode, and share it with a friend or someone who might need it. For deeper reflections, weekly essays, and the conversations that don't fit on the podcast, join me on Substack at sarastansberry.substack.com. And remember, you're allowed to begin again. You're allowed to build a life that feels like your own, and you're allowed to live the life you were meant to. I'll see you next time.